Hello, my name is Giulia Bovolenta, and today I will talk to you about a research project which I'm working on with Emma Marsden at the University of York. And we're looking at the effect of Surprisal on the acquisition of new syntactic structures. When we say Surprisal, we mean the violation of expectations in a very general sense. We are not focusing on Surprisal in a computational sense. And I will present data from the first study that we've run as part of this project. First of all, we know that Surprisal, the violation of expectations, can aid learning in the sense that it can aid the formation of new memories. For instance, novel associations are better remembered if they violate established patterns, which is an effect known as one-shot declarative learning. And we also know that, for instance, in a test, feedback on test answers which is unexpected is better remembered than expected feedback. And there's also evidence from language acquisition research, specifically first language acquisition, showing that violating children's expectations improves their acquisition of new vocabulary. But of course, language is more than vocabulary. There is structure too, and in a usage-based approach to language acquisition, we assume that abstract structural knowledge emerges from individual stored instances of structure use, so from individual memories. So what we asked then was if Surprisal can aid the formation of new individual memories, and the emergence of abstract structure proceeds from individual memories, will then Surprisal lead to better abstract structural knowledge in the acquisition of a new syntactic structure? That was our main research question, and we set out to answer it using a 3-day online artificial language learning study. We recruited adult native English speakers through Prolific, and we exposed them to an artificial language with an uninstructed learning paradigm. There were 2 groups and who did mostly the same tasks, but we manipulated the nature of the tasks so that the experimental group or Surprisal group obviously had an element of Surprisal in their learning. The artificial language we used is called Norwegian. It's a fully artificial language with 4 nouns, 8 verbs, and 2 function words. Specific pairings between meanings and words were randomly assigned for each participant. In addition to the 8 verbs which we used to teach the language, we also had 4 so-called generalization verbs, which we reserved for a structure test at the end of the study, to test participants' ability to generalize the structures they learned to new instances. And the structures which they were expected to learn are an active and a passive structure, which were formed following the same patterns that are found in Norwegian, so a natural language. They were both SVO, but the active structure started with the agent, followed by the verb with a specific active inflection, followed by the patient. The passive, by contrast, started with the patient, followed by the verb with a specific passive inflection by the preposition by, and finally the agent. We wanted to replicate a real-life learning scenarios where learners may struggle to acquire a new syntactic structure which is marked because it's low frequency, it's more complex, which is often, in fact, the case with a passive, for instance, in English. So to achieve this, we only introduced the passive starting from day 2, after the active had already been learned and consolidated to an extent. And we focused our Surprisal manipulation on the passive. So we wanted to see whether the Surprisal group would eventually develop better knowledge of the passive relative to the control group. We used a cross-situational learning paradigm to teach the language, which we adapted from Walker et al. 2020, and participants heard the sentences presented orally through audio speakers, and they saw two pictures on screen, one which was the correct picture, which depicted the meaning of the sentence, and one which was a foil incorrect picture. And we use this basic procedure both for training and testing, obviously with some modifications between trial types, which I will now illustrate. So basic learning trials follow the procedure I just outlined. So participants saw two pictures on screen whilst hearing a sentence played through the speakers, and their task was to press a button on the keyboard to indicate which of the two pictures they thought was a correct depiction of the sentence. And after they gave their answer, they didn't receive any feedback, but the program just moved on to the next trial. Starting from second day, we did introduce some trials, learning trials with feedback. And the default type of learning trial with feedback was a congruent kind of feedback. And this was a feedback that the control group got throughout the study and that the Surprisal group got most of the time. So this would be a feedback trial in the traditional sense, as it were. So participants would perform their learning trial, so listen to the sentence, give their answer, and after they gave their answer, they would see the correct picture only on screen and hear the sentence again. And they received feedback regardless of whether they had answered correctly or incorrectly. There was also a specific type of feedback trial, which we call a Surprisal feedback trial, which is what participants in the Surprisal group occasionally experienced. And it looked just like the standard feedback trial, in the sense that it started with a learning trial. Participants heard the sentence, gave their answer by button press, and then they saw the correct picture again, and they heard the sentence again. But this time, the sentence was recast in the other, using the other syntactic structure. Specifically, this kind of Surprisal trial was only used for active sentences. So participants gave their answer to an active sentence, and when they heard the feedback, the sentence had been recast in the passive form. So this sentence is the correct description of this picture, but using the passive instead of the active. There were also structure test trials, which we used to probe participants' understanding and ability to interpret the two structures. Just like in a learning trial, we had a correct picture and a foil picture, but the difference here was that the foil picture, instead of being selected at random, contained the exact same entities as the correct picture and the same action as well. And the only difference was that the agent and patient roles were reversed. So when participants heard the sentence, in order to pick the correct picture, they had to select the correct structural interpretation of this sentence, so as an active or passive, because the nouns and the verb did not give enough information to select the correct answer, because they were essentially found in both scenes. So on day 2, both groups were exposed to active sentences only through standard learning trials. On day 1, and then on day 2, we introduced passive trials, and we also introduced feedback. And feedback was initially of the default congruent type for both groups, but then in the second half of the session, we introduced some incongruent feedback for the Surprisal group. And as I mentioned, this was done to active trials only, which means that surprising feedback recasts were always in the passive form. And to ensure that both groups had exactly the same amount of exposure to the passive, not just in learning trials, but in these feedback sort of recast turns too, we ensured that the control group had more feedback to passive learning trials than to active ones. This way they had the same amount of feedback in the passive form as the Surprisal group did. We had structure tests using the familiar trained verbs on both day 2 and day 3, and at the end of day 3 we had another structure test which used those new generalization verbs that I described earlier. I will now present the results, which are from the 70 participants who completed the study and were included in the analysis. And on day 1, we see that participants, as we would expect from previous research using cross-situational learning paradigms, they start at chance, so they are guessing to begin with, and then they gradually acquire some knowledge of the language, and they improve their performance. And on day 2, we see that, again, where we introduce the surprise manipulation, there is no immediate effect. We would expect to see an effect here. This is the first structure test, which takes place after the manipulation. But again, we don't see, against our prediction, we don't see any significant differences between groups at this stage. On day 3, we see that they both have mastered the vocabulary, and we have another test, another structure test with familiar verbs again, and again we see no significant differences between groups yet, although I should specify that there was a technical error, unfortunately, with this particular test block, so the conclusions that we can draw are perhaps limited. But as it stands, we have no, with the data we have, obviously we have no evidence of a difference between groups. Where we do observe a difference between groups is in the third test block, which is the generalization test block. And here, if we break it down by structures, so participants answer to passive and to active sentences, we see that both groups are better in their interpretation of the active. So they're more accurate with the active than with the passive, which we would expect, given that the active was the default structure and the more frequent structure. We were expecting, if you recall, the Surprisal group to be better than the control group on the passive, because that's where we focused our surprisal manipulation. And indeed, they are. Strikingly, the control group is actually a chance level on the passive. So it doesn't seem as if they have acquired it, really. But what we did find, which we did not expect, is actually a main effect of groups. So the Surprisal group is better than the control group, both in the passive structure and on the active structure, which actually wasn't targeted by the surprisal manipulation. So the conclusions that we can draw then are that the Surprisal group had higher accuracy in structure comprehension, and this emerged in generalization. Actually, it did not emerge with familiar verbs, but the effect was found on both structures, including the default structure. So the question we asked is, then what did our manipulation actually do? Because while it did something, it's not clear that it did what we were expecting it to do. So one possibility is that Surprisal just enhanced attention to the relevant feature by making passives and those distinctive features of the passives more salient. A related possibility is that participants in the Surprisal group developed stronger explicit knowledge, so they became more aware of the functional distinctions between the two structures because of the nature of the experimental design, because we generated Surprisal essentially by juxtaposing a passive structure right after an active structure and by using an active and a passive structure to describe the same picture. So it's possible that this specific manipulation made participants more aware of the functional distinctions. We had an awareness questionnaire at the end, a debriefing questionnaire at the end, where we also asked participants to describe the difference between the two types of sentence if they could. And the Surprisal group were numerically more likely to be able to give us a description. However, this is not statistically significant, so it's really inconclusive. We don't know whether we would find the difference, with a big sample, or whether it's just there just isn't one. So we have no evidence either way. And the other problem would be then to establish a causal link between awareness and accuracy. So whether better explicit knowledge led the Surprisal group to better performance, or whether stronger structural knowledge is what led to both better performance and greater awareness of the functional distinctions. So future developments of this research, which we are already actually working on, are then ways of investigating Surprisal, which does not involve juxtaposing structures this way. And also, and one other way to test our hypothesis would be to introduce a test of item memory to test the idea that any improvement in structural knowledge is actually due to better memory for individual instances. We are currently working on a follow-up which has these features, so there will hopefully be more data coming soon. And for this, thank you for your attention.